The Vodun of Benin, the original voodoo that survived slavery, the spiritual tradition so powerful it survived the Middle Passage and emerged as the official religion of an entire nation. Long before Hollywood transformed it into caricature, long before the word voodoo became synonymous with pins and dolls and manufactured fear, there existed a spiritual system so comprehensive and so resilient that it would survive one of history's greatest attempts at cultural annihilation. In the region now known as the Republic of Benin, formerly the Kingdom of Dahomey, the Fon and Yu peoples developed Vodun, a tradition that would be carried in the memories of enslaved people across an ocean and would persist against every effort to destroy it for more than 5 centuries. The historical reality contains a complexity that challenges simple narratives. The Kingdom of Dahomey stands as one of the most aggressive participants in the Atlantic slave trade, capturing enemies and sometimes its own citizens to sell to European and American traders. The people who arrived in Haiti, Brazil, and Cuba carrying Vodun in their consciousness had often experienced enslavement by other Africans before their sale to Europeans. This historical truth does not diminish what follows: the extraordinary achievement of a tradition that not only survived, but maintained its essential structure through conditions specifically designed to erase it. Vodun in Benin exists simultaneously as the ancestor of Haitian Vodou, Louisiana Voodoo, and Cuban variations, and as a living practice that continues its own evolution on African soil. The tradition organizes itself around a pantheon of Vodun, divine forces that govern specific domains of existence and manifest through possession of initiated priests and priestesses. Each Vodun maintains distinct characteristics, requirements, and jurisdictions. Sakpata governs smallpox and skin diseases. Zevioso commands thunder and justice, corresponding to the Yoruba deity Shango. Mamiwata, the water spirit, controls wealth, beauty, and dangerous attraction. Dan, the serpent Vodun, represents continuity and prosperity, recognized in Haiti as Dambala. These entities demand specific offerings, specific colors, specific rhythms, specific days of acknowledgement. The academic documentation of this tradition begins in earnest with anthropologist Melville Herskovits, who conducted foundational comparative research between Dahomeyan Vodun and its New World descendants. His 1938 publication, Dahomey, an ancient West African kingdom, provided detailed accounts of ritual structures, theological concepts, and ceremonial elements. 3 years later, the myth of the Negro past challenged the prevailing academic assumption that enslaved Africans had been completely stripped of cultural heritage. Herskovits argued, with documented evidence, that specific elements of African spiritual practice had survived the Middle Passage intact, recognizable patterns that persisted in Brazil, Cuba, and Haiti despite centuries of suppression. The survival of Vodun in Benin itself presents equally remarkable testimony to spiritual resilience. The tradition persisted through French colonial rule, through aggressive Christian missionary activity that characterized African spiritual practices as primitive superstition, and through the explicitly atheist Marxist government of Matthew Kérékou from 1972 to 1991. Colonial powers worked systematically to exterminate Vodun practice. Missionaries portrayed it as devil worship. The Marxist state attempted to replace it with state ideology. When the Kérékou government ended, Vodun emerged intact, its practitioners having maintained ceremonies, initiations, and knowledge transmission through decades of official hostility. The moment of public reclamation arrives in January 1996, when Benin declares January 10th as National Vodun Day, a public holiday honoring the tradition as the nation's official religion. This represents one of the most significant acts of African cultural reclamation of the late 20th century. A spiritual system that colonial powers had attempted to erase becomes recognized as national heritage, worthy of celebration rather than suppression. Academic study accelerates after the end of the Kérékou era. Researchers from France, the United States, Brazil, and Benin conduct extensive fieldwork, documenting a tradition of extraordinary complexity. The Vodun pantheon operates through strict protocols. Each entity requires ritual feeding according to specific schedules. Colors matter. Certain Vodun will not accept offerings presented in incorrect colors. Rhythms matter. Drum patterns that invoke one Vodun will not invoke another. Days matter. Ceremonies performed on incorrect days lack spiritual efficacy. The documentation reveals remarkable consistency between 17th century accounts of Dahomeyan practice and contemporary Beninese rituals, evidence of a tradition that maintained core protocols through conditions designed to destroy them. The practical manifestation of Vodun power that generates both respect and fear within Beninese culture takes the form of bo, ritual objects charged with spiritual force to affect specific outcomes. Bo practice represents the dimension of Vodun most fundamentally misrepresented by popular culture. The Hollywood voodoo doll bears almost no resemblance to actual bo construction and deployment. Anthropologists have documented bo objects since the 19th century. These constructions may incorporate earth from specific locations, feathers from specific birds, herbs with particular spiritual properties, and ritual words spoken in specific sequences. Specialists called bosio makers assemble these objects according to precise spiritual mechanics. Anthropologist Susan Preston Bleer conducts extensive research on bosio practice, publishing her findings in the 1995 work African Vodun, Art, Psychology, and Power. Her documentation includes cases of bo deployment for both protection and harm. The harm-directed cases demonstrate patterns of specific, targeted effects on specific individuals. The affected parties interpret these effects as supernatural. The bosio makers describe their work in terms of spiritual mechanics rather than metaphysics, technical procedures that produce reliable results when executed correctly. The dangerous reputation of bo practice within Benin stems from documented cases where individuals experience afflictions that medical intervention fails to address, and that resolve only through spiritual countermeasures. These cases follow recognizable patterns. A person offends a Vodun priest or fails to fulfill a spiritual obligation. Illness follows. Medical treatment provides no relief. The afflicted person consults a diviner. The diviner identifies spiritual causation. Appropriate ritual response produces resolution. Resolution of Vodun-related afflictions follows established protocol. The process begins with divination, typically Fa divination, the Fon equivalent of the Yoruba Ifa system. The diviner casts palm nuts or a divining chain to determine which Vodun has been offended, which ancestral obligation has been neglected, or which bo object has been deployed against the afflicted person. Prescription follows identification. The diviner specifies offerings to the offended Vodun, ritual purification baths, destruction of the bo object if it can be located, and counter-ritual work performed by a specialist with sufficient spiritual authority to address the identified entity. A documented case from 1988 illustrates this process. In Dahomey, Benin's historical capital, a family patriarch sells a piece of ancestral land without proper spiritual consultation. The land sale disrupts the Vodun associated with the family compound. 3 family members fall ill in sequence. Medical treatment provides no improvement. The family consults a Fa diviner. The diviner identifies the cause. The land Vodun has been offended by the unauthorized sale. A ceremony to acknowledge and compensate the land Vodun follows. The illnesses resolve over subsequent months. The family attributes the resolution to the ritual intervention. The pattern repeats throughout documented cases, spiritual diagnosis followed by spiritual prescription, producing practical results. The gathering in Ouidah in 1993 represents a watershed moment in Vodun history. The city of Ouidah served as one of the major ports from which enslaved Africans departed for the Americas. The Ouidah 92 festival, held in 1993, brings together Vodun practitioners from Benin, Haiti, Brazil, Cuba, Trinidad, and the United States. For the first time, the diaspora meets its African source, not in the context of academic study, but in shared spiritual identity. Participants describe recognizing ritual structures they had practiced throughout their lives, but had never known the African origin of. They hear rhythms they recognize. They see gestures they perform in their own ceremonies. They recognize entities they serve, appearing in different ceremonial dress, but maintaining recognizable characteristics. Brazilian practitioners of candomblé identify correspondences between their Oroxars and Beninese Vodun. Cuban practitioners of Santeria recognize patterns they know from their own tradition. Haitian practitioners of Vodou encounter the source forms of the LWA they serve. The recognition flows in both directions. Beninese practitioners see their Vodun alive and transformed in the practices of the diaspora. The experience generates profound emotional and spiritual impact, documented by participants as reunification after centuries of forced separation. The survival mechanism of Vodun across the Middle Passage demonstrates the durability of cultural memory under extreme duress. Enslaved people arrived in the Americas stripped of material possessions, separated from family, forbidden to practice their religions, subjected to forced Christian conversion. Yet they maintained the essential structures of Vodun practice. They remembered the rhythms, they remembered the gestures, they remembered which entities governed which domains, they remembered initiation protocols. They adapted these elements to new contexts, incorporating Catholic saints as covers for African entities, using available materials for ritual objects, creating new ceremonial forms that preserved ancient structures. The theological sophistication of Vodun becomes evident in comparative documentation. The tradition operates on principles of reciprocity between human and divine realms. Vodun entities provide protection, guidance, and intervention in human affairs. Humans provide offerings, ceremonies, and respect. The relationship functions transactionally. Specific offerings produce specific results. A Vodun who receives proper service provides proper protection. A Vodun who experiences neglect withdraws protection. An offended Vodun causes affliction until proper compensation restores the relationship. This theological framework survived intact from Africa to the Americas, recognizable in Haitian Vodou's relationship with LWA, in Candomblé's relationship with Oroxars, in Santeria's relationship with Santos. The possession phenomenon central to Vodun practice follows strict protocols. Not everyone can be possessed. Initiation prepares the body and consciousness to serve as vessel for divine forces. During ceremonies, specific rhythms invoke specific Vodun. The entity mounts the initiate, who loses ordinary consciousness as the Vodun takes control. The possessed person displays the characteristic behaviors of that particular Vodun, specific movements, specific speech patterns, specific preferences. Sakpata, when mounted on an initiate, manifests characteristics associated with disease and healing. Zevioso manifests characteristics of thunder and justice. The possession ends when the rhythms change, releasing the Vodun and returning ordinary consciousness to the initiate. Comparative research documents the persistence of this possession structure across the Atlantic. Haitian Vodou ceremonies follow the same pattern. Specific rhythms invoke specific LWA who mount initiates and manifest characteristic behaviors. Cuban Santeria ceremonies demonstrate the same structure. Brazilian candomblé ceremonies maintain the pattern. The consistency across different nations, different languages, different historical circumstances provides evidence that these elements represent core components of the tradition, maintained through deliberate cultural transmission rather than coincidental similarity. The recognition of Vodun as Benin's official national religion carries political and cultural significance beyond mere acknowledgement of historical tradition. The declaration represents rejection of colonial characterizations of African spirituality as primitive superstition. It asserts the validity of indigenous African theological systems against European religious imperialism. It reclaims cultural identity that colonialism attempted to erase. The establishment of National Vodun Day transforms a suppressed tradition into celebrated heritage, from shameful past to honored present. Contemporary Vodun practice in Benin incorporates new elements while maintaining traditional structures. Urban practitioners adapt ceremonies to city contexts. Young initiates navigate Vodun service alongside modern education and employment. The tradition addresses contemporary concerns: economic security, political protection, relationship stability, through ancient spiritual mechanics. New Vodun emerged to address new circumstances. The tradition demonstrates living evolution rather than static preservation, maintaining essential protocols while adapting to changing contexts. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.